Before Salem, Europe had already turned witch hunting into a full-blown horror show that lasted for decades. And nowhere was that more apparent than the German lands of the Holy Roman Empire. It is a story so dramatic and so grotesque that it is now being resurrected not just by historians, but by pop culture via one of my favorite video game series of all time, Ubisoft's Assassin's Creed, with their upcoming title, Codename Hexe. And yes, as far as I am aware, that is the proper German way to pronounce it, although there's a lot more German phrases in this podcast that I'm going to try to not, but probably will mispronounce. Wish me luck, please. Hexe promises to plunge players directly into the world of 16th and 17th century witch persecutions. Now, the title itself is not subtle. Hexe is the German word for witch, rooted in the older Hexisa or Hexusa, meaning hedge rider, somebody who straddles the line between the village and the wilderness, between the ordinary and the supernatural. In the 16th century, being called a hexe wasn't just an insult. It was an accusation of sorcery, devil's pacts, and harmful magic, the kind of word that could absolutely get you put in chains. Now, the game's teaser vid shows a pentagram etched assassin symbol dangling in a dark forest with inscriptions in Old German that some gamers are saying seems to be invoking Mephisto. Gaming journalists are calling this already possibly the darkest Assassin's Creed yet, which means it is tailor-made for me. I'm so excited. And the figures and the places that the teaser trailer hints at aren't just random made-up places or spots. They pull directly from history. Prince Bishop Dornheim of Bamberg, Johannes Junius's infamous letter, Paracelsus's magical alphabets, Cologne's relics and manuscripts, and even Pope Leo X, the Medici Pope whose corruption helped ignite the Reformation. So what's history in all of this, and what is stylized horror? That is what we're digging into today. I'm going to be taking a look at the cultural practices that got people accused, the politics that helped fuel the fire, the occult texts that terrified the courts, and why Germany's witch hunts dwarfed anything that happened over at Salem. Not that it's a competition, but whoa, man. Germany went on for decades. It was incredibly brutal. And oddly enough, the two do have something in common, which we will talk about later on in the show. Along the way, we're going to also compare Ubisoft's imagery with the historical record, because sometimes the line between fact and folklore isn't nearly as clear as you would think. So with that, welcome, Seekers, to the Occulture Shock Podcast episode that I'm calling Burn the Devil Out, Assassin's Creed Hexe, and the Real German Witchcraft Trials. Now, to understand why fear spreads so fast, we first need to ask, what exactly did people mean by magic in early modern Germany? It's not necessarily broomsticks and cauldrons. Magic covered a whole spectrum. At the village level, folk practices dominated with healing charms, fertility spells, and storm protection. For example, if hail destroyed your crops, your family starved. So something like weather magic wasn't a joke. It was survival. Medicine and astrology were also closely linked as well. Physicians timed treatments to planetary movements, convinced that the heavens shaped health and destiny. Even mainstream Christianity blurred into magical thinking. For example, again, pilgrims carried relics as protective talismans, and priests wrote prayers onto slips of paper that people could wear like charms. At the elite level, you had alchemy, necromancy, and grimoires like the Picatrix or the Key of Solomon, which I also have somewhere around in this room, but I can't find, which is very concerning. These weren't cheap street books. These were copied by hand and shared amongst scholars and occultists. And this is where Assassin's Creed Hexe starts to echo history. That assassin symbol inscribed with strange characters, to a gamer, it looks spooky. To a villager in 1626, a page filled with those sigils could be the very evidence that they needed to get you chained to the rack. And courts had no shortage of those chains. Between 1580 and 1650, witch trials reached their peak in the German lands of the Holy Roman Empire. And here's the catch. This wasn't a unified country. It was a patchwork of 300 duchies, bishoprics, and free cities, each with their own courts and their own rulers and their own laws. It was a mess. That fragmentation turned out to be deadly. In England or France, hunts were sporadic. In Germany, a single prince bishop could unleash mass persecution completely unchecked. The Carolina Code of 1532 legalized torture. And once confessions were then extracted, suspects were also forced to then name accomplices. Hunts spread like wildfire through entire communities. Some of the worst cases were in Trier, where hundreds were executed under Jesuit authority between 1581 and 1593, and in another town called Würzburg, where nearly 900 people died between 1626 and 1631, which included nobles, students, and even children. So no one was safe. But the epicenter of the German witch hunts and the place that Ubisoft chose for Hexe's antagonist was Bamberg. Now, from 1626 to 1631, Bamberg was ruled by Prince Bishop Johann George II Fuch von Dornheim. Locals called him the Hexenbischof, aka the Witch Bishop. I almost called him the Witch Bischof, but that's a cookie. Anyway, moving on. He built a special prison called the Drudenhaus, designed solely for witches. Its 26 cells were carved with biblical warnings. Inside, suspects were tortured until they confessed to stuff like blighting crops, summoning frost, or sealing pacts with the devil. Records show more than 600 people executed in just a few years. We've got merchants, we've got nobles, we even have city officials. One of the most chilling stories is that of Johannes Junius, the mayor of Bamberg. Arrested in 1628, he was tortured into confessing. However, he managed, before his execution, to smuggle a letter to his daughter Veronica. In this letter, he describes how he was strapped into thumb screws and leg vices, and how he was forced to name names, how he admitted to lies just to stop the torment. Quote, "Dear child," he writes, "I must confess, though I am innocent. If you do not, you are tortured until you invent something." Unquote. That letter that he sent his daughter still exists to this day and is preserved over at the Staatsarchiv in Bromberg. It has been translated and published in multiple collections, and anyone can read it. If you're curious, I recommend you do so, because it is one of the rarest things to survive. It is a direct voice from the condemned themselves, unfiltered by inquisitors or judges. And above all of this loomed the corruption of the church. At the very top sat Pope Leo X, Giovanni de' Medici. Born into Florence's most powerful family, he became pope in 1513. He embodied the Renaissance excess, lavish hunts, elaborate banquets, and costly patronage of Raphael and Michelangelo, although I'm a little biased when it comes to those two because I like art. But his most notorious act was selling indulgences to fund St. Peter's Basilica. So, what is an indulgence, besides me eating an entire bag of cookies in one sitting? An indulgence was, in simple terms, a document issued by the Catholic Church that promised the remission of temporal punishments for sins. The idea was rooted in church teachings on penance. Even after confession and forgiveness, the sinner still technically owed a kind of spiritual debt that would have to be paid through good works, prayer, time in purgatory, what have you. An indulgence reduced or canceled that debt. By the late Middle Ages, indulgences had become something that you could then buy. Preachers traveled across Europe selling them for money that went to church projects. In the early 1500s, under Pope Leo X, indulgences were sold aggressively to finance the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. The faithful were told that their coins could shorten suffering in purgatory, not only just for themselves, but even for their deceased relatives. Critics like Martin Luther thought that this practice was nothing short of spiritual corruption, because that's kind of exactly what it was. Salvation being marketed like a commodity, turning faith into a cash transaction. It was this scandal, more than almost anything else, that lit the fuse of the Protestant Reformation. Leo's papacy became the symbol of everything corrupt and wrong in the church, fueling the Reformation and fanning the paranoia that made witch hunting seem righteous at the time. And while Bamberg, Würzburg, and Trier were drowning in executions, there were other cities that carried the atmosphere of witchcraft but without the same amount of body counts. Cologne, another major locale in the game, also where Gamescom is held every year, you guys, for instance, wasn't consumed by mass trials, but it was steeped in esoteric associations. Its cathedral, which you can go to and is super awesome, housed the relics of the Magi. I've also heard Magi, I've also heard Magi. We're going to go with Magi. The same Magi who, according to the Gospel of Matthew, brought gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh to the infant Jesus. But here is the twist, and it's a good one. In the original Greek, they weren't called kings. They were a Persian priestly class, known for astrology and ritual knowledge. Over time, Christian tradition reimagined them as kings. Yet the very word magi is where our word magic comes from. And who is familiar with and educated in magic during those times? Wise men. Sorcerers, which means Cologne's most prized relics housed in their cathedral from the Magi embody a paradox. Some might say a hypocrisy. On one hand, holy pilgrims from the East honoring Christ, and on the other hand, figures linguistically tied to the very practice that inquisitors were burning people alive for. Layer that with Faustian legends placing the infamous scholar-doctor in Cologne's streets, bargaining with the devil, and with monasteries quietly circulating alchemical texts, even as archbishops ban grimoires, and you can see the tension. Even though Cologne wasn't a city of mass burnings, it was a city where relics, rumors, and occult manuscripts all coexisted in the very shadow of orthodoxy. That wider German Holy Roman Empire landscape explains why Bamberg and Cologne make sense for Assassin's Creed Hexe. Ubisoft didn't need to invent a Gothic nightmare because the nightmare already happened right then and there. But fear also didn't just feed on accusations. There had a lot more stuff going on. It also latched itself onto symbols. And this then brings us to one of the strangest creations of the era, the alphabet of the Magi. Bringing those guys back around. The man behind it was, and this is one hell of a name, so I'm sorry, wish me luck, Philippus Aureolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, better known as Paracelsus. Born in 1493, he trained across Europe in medicine, mining, and in alchemy. He mocked the medical establishment at the time, called university doctors frauds, and even burned medical texts in public. But he wasn't just nothing but bluster. He actually treated plague victims. He also dissected bodies for science and declared that all things are poison. It's the dose that makes the poison, which is a principle that still underpins toxicology to this very day. For Paracelsus, the cosmos was written in symbols. Illness could come from astral or spiritual imbalance. Healing meant harmonizing all of the three realms. Out of this worldview, he creates the alphabet of the Magi. This isn't your Sesame Street level ABCs. This has 22 characters, each like a rune or a sigil, designed to inscribe divine names and angelic powers. Paracelsus believed that human language itself had been corrupted, and by inventing a new script, he could then purify sacred writing. Writing the name of God or an angel in this alphabet wasn't then just symbolic, it was also unlocking the divine force. Now, the letters carried specific functions. One of them looked like a tilted cross with hooks on the end. That was used for divine protection. There was another one that resembled a fish hook, meant for healing the body when it was worn close to the skin. There was a starburst one that had kind of ties to the sun and was thought to bring about vitality and ward off melancholy. There's a crescent sigil linked to the moon and was connected to the idea of fertility and cycles of growth. Now, these weren't decorations. These were correspondence magic. They were prescriptions and spells that you could wear like medicine. But in witch trial Germany, a notebook filled with such characters like that, if they found it on you, that would spell your doom. Trial records list books of characters as incriminating evidence. And once again, Cologne sits at a crossroads. It was a hub of manuscripts and printing, a place where Paracelsian ideas circulated even as archbishops condemned them. Sacred relics and hidden alphabets sat very uneasily side by side. Ubisoft leans into that tension. The assassin's emblem, inscribed with the strange sigils, looks like something lifted straight from Paracelsus's playbook. To a modern gamer, it's immersive world building. To a villager in 1626, it was proof of sorcery. Confessions under torture often included blood pacts, devil's marks, or contracts signed in strange alphabets. To interrogators, these weren't metaphors. They were literal legal proof of consorting with hell. And Ubisoft pulls that straight into Hexe by possibly tying sigils inspired by Paracelsus's alphabet to Mephisto, which some observant gamers have said they've noticed inscribed within the trailer's logo. If so, the game then fuses two of early modern Germany's most terrifying ideas: hidden writing that could channel divine or demonic forces, and the devil's right-hand man offering power in exchange for damnation. Come see, come saw. And speaking of Mephisto, let's move on to the figure of Mephistopheles, whose name is often shortened to Mephisto, and first appeared in the 16th century Faust tales, not just the musical Cats. Mephisto is a demon who served Lucifer by tempting scholars with knowledge and power. The name itself is thought to have Hebrew origins, possibly meaning one who shuns the light or one who loves not the light. In Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, he promises 24 years of earthly pleasures in exchange for a soul. In Goethe's Faust, he's subtler, offering knowledge, successful seduction, and powerful influence, but is never really satisfied. Summoning him requires ritual circles, incantations, and, above all else, signing a pact in blood. That signature in blood became the archetype of the diabolical contract. It is the devil's paperwork binding souls for eternity. As if making deals with the devil isn't enough, Ubisoft goes further still, whispering about a hidden piece of Eden buried in the Salzburg Mountains. That may sound like Assassin's Creed fantasy trying to tie everything together story-wise, but it plays on an older, real-world obsession with hidden or lost relics of power. Think Ark of the Covenant, said to be buried underneath temples. The Holy Grail, concealed in caves. The Spear of Destiny, shifted from Rome to Nuremberg, always tied to the fate of empires. For centuries, humankind loves to believe in sacred power being hidden, waiting for somebody bold enough or foolish enough or blessed enough to dig it back up. And that obsession with hidden power then brings us across the ocean to Salem. Told you we would talk about it again. Now, most people know the Salem story. 1692, about 20 people executed, roughly 200 accused, and the panic over in less than a year. Germany's trials, by contrast, stretched across 2 centuries and killed tens of thousands. Salem relied on spectral evidence, visions and dreams. Germany institutionalized torture. Salem was one colony. Germany was hundreds of jurisdictions, each free to launch its own purge. And yet, the connection between the two is real. The Malleus Maleficarum, written in Germany in 1487, was the manual that taught courts how to identify witches. Its influence crossed the Atlantic and shaped Puritan fears in New England. Salem was an echo of what Germany had already perfected. By the 18th century, Enlightenment thinking and legal reforms dismantled the machinery of mass trials. But the symbols didn't disappear. Freemasons and Theosophists picked up the magical alphabets. Occult revivalists resurrected them for talismanic art. Even today, modern practitioners sometimes use the alphabet of the Magi for intention setting and ritual. The popular culture keeps circling the occult back into business, and Assassin's Creed Hexe is just the latest retelling. The real question is going to be whether it will reinforce witchcraft as supernatural horror or whether it will nudge players to see how fear and power combined to kill thousands. Because witch trials aren't just spooky aesthetics. They were once law. They were once politics. They were survival twisted into paranoia. In 16th century Germany, a talisman, a rune, or a whispered charm could be enough to send you to the stake to burn. As Ubisoft prepares to release Hexe, players may see Bamberg's prisons, Paracelsus's alphabets, Mephisto's shadow, Pope Leo X's corruption, and Cologne's relics. But behind those images lie real histories, brilliant innovators, political chaos, and thousands of silenced voices, because history always leaves a trace if you know where to look. Thank you all for listening or watching today's Occulture Shock podcast. New episodes go live every Tuesday if you're interested in supporting the show, as well as having access to extra show goodies that I make, including early access to this show and ad-free episodes. Feel free to join us over on our Patreon page at patreon.com/Occulture Shock podcast. Speaking of which, no pun intended, special shout out to our latest member and fellow seeker, Ricky. Thank you, Ricky, for joining us over on Patreon and helping to support the show. I am your writer, your host, and your editor, Jessica Chobot. You can find me across most social media pages, but I'm the most active over on my Instagram. My official and my only handle over there is at Jessica_Chobot. This has been the Occulture Shock podcast. Thank you again for getting weird with me today. Until next time, toodles! And if you're Ubisoft and you have an early copy, feel free to send it my way.